Welcome back to the show. The housing crisis is leaving millions around the world unable to afford having a home. But what really drives this crisis, and can we find solutions in the way we design our cities? Let's take a look at the story in greater depth. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. David Rudlin, who is the principal and director of Urbanism, Environment and Design, which is a research consultancy. He's also author of Climate City. He joins us from Manchester. Also joining us today is Professor Lyal Sunga, who is a human rights expert. He joins us from Rome. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Rudlin, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we talk about the fact that many are being left behind in the world when it comes to having shelter or a home, how widespread of a problem do you feel like this is, especially when we're talking about nations which have been doing fairly well, developed nations?
I think the global figures are something like 1 in 8 people are living in informal settlements or without housing. But actually about a third of new housing production in the world is informal as well. So the problem is huge. The problem is huge. And actually, I'm speaking here from Manchester in the UK, and we have the problem here as much, well, maybe not as much as some places, but certainly we have a problem here. It is a global problem in terms of the amount of housing we have and the equity with which it's distributed.
Right. We're talking about the which this is distributed, the basic right to having shelter and to being warm in your own home. But Professor Sunga, when we try to understand this problem, is there a global framework in which we can understand the issue of homelessness? And is it different from the case of displacement?
Well, it's related to displacement simply because the right to adequate housing, is the way it's framed in international human rights law, is related to, for example, climate change, natural disasters, and refugee movements, and as was mentioned by the previous, my colleague, lack of equity in distribution in terms of making the right to adequate housing a state priority. I mean, if you think that today there's, UN Habitat estimates around 150 million people worldwide are homeless, and something like 1.5 billion, it's a good proportion of the world's population, is inadequately housed. So that's a lot of a huge proportion of the world's population that is affected. Just if I can just add something quickly, it doesn't only affect the right to adequate housing per se. It's integrally linked, obviously, to the right to health, right to education, especially for children who are implicated. And it means that a lot of the other rights, economic, social, cultural rights, and also civil and political rights, very hard to enjoy or to exercise when the right to adequate housing is not properly provided and guaranteed and implemented at national level.
You're talking about the various other rights that are hindered or undermined, or the access of them is denied when you don't have access to proper housing. Can we also expand on the dangers and the human rights violations that become more possible when people are not given proper security or proper shelter?
Sure. If you look a little bit more closely at what does the right to adequate housing mean, you have to look at public spaces, access to public services, electricity, sewage, garbage disposal, and nobody's saying that the state has to provide luxury housing for everybody. Or even free of charge. That's not the issue. The issue is that you have to be able to make sure that every individual and families are living in peace and security and dignity. And sometimes people say, well, why should the state do this? And I just want to mention that the executive director of UN Habitat mentioned, it was Dr. Juan Close. He said a couple of years ago something I think that was very important. And he said that leaving the housing market entirely to the private sector has proven to be a big failure. So the state has to take a lead. And if we just remember back in 2008, what happened, you had massive disruption in the economy, which started with the housing crisis. And that was turned out to be a global phenomenon. And now with other challenges that we're facing, it's for me a time bomb that we're sitting on unless we put proper resources. Just one last thing I want to say is that $4.7 billion is spent per day on arms.
Right.
So some of this can be spent on housing as well as education, schools,
right.
and hospitals. And
right. Professor Sunga, stay with me on that important point. You mentioned a quote there, and it alludes towards a policy failure. Mr. David Rudlin, do you see this crisis as a part of a policy failure?
It is a policy failure. I think the issue is largely to do with urbanisation. So what is happening across the world is people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, and that's happening at differential rates. So in Europe, we're 80% urbanised, and so that movement is relatively small. In China, it's about 55–60%. In Pakistan, I think it's about a third urbanised at the moment, and the projections are that that will become 2/3 urbanised within the next 30–40 years. Now, that's a huge rate of people moving to cities and requiring housing, and very few societies are able to match that rate of building. The only one that actually is able to do it is China. So in China, they're building housing for 10 million people a year moving to cities, and they're doing so, but they're doing so by building huge towers, forests of towers, very badly connected quite often to the cities, and 1,000 new towns. Now, whether states have the capacity to do that, and states which are facing huge levels of urbanisation are able to do that is another matter. There is another way of doing this, which is to facilitate people to solve their own problems. A lot of people turn up in cities, of course, end up in slums, and slums are dreadful for all sorts of reasons. But the work that's going on elsewhere shows that by giving people tenure, by giving them low-cost loans, by giving them access to advice, then they can actually create good quality habitation themselves rather than relying on the state to do it. And my personal view is that actually that latter solution of self-help is probably a better solution than, say, building millions of homes.
Right. Mr. Rudlin, with me on that point, I just want to put a last question to Professor Lyal Sunga. Professor Sunga, when we talked earlier about the fact that displacement is going to increase all around the world, especially due to conflict and climate, what do you foresee happening in the next couple of years, given the conditions that already exist when it comes to housing?
Well, it just means that greater numbers of people are left in very vulnerable conditions. That is a recipe for social instability, spread of disease and epidemics and discontent, and in some cases violence, depending on the situation. So it's a very serious issue. I'm glad that Mr. Rudlin was mentioning that municipal approaches on the cities and urbanization, because it's very much linked towards having a national housing policy as part of the urban policy framework in all countries. So that is key. And I just want to mention that the UN in 2016 in Quito, in Ecuador, had developed, I think, a very important policy framework where member states of the UN should share best practices in terms of concrete measures to ensure that states take the lead, but that they also, and this is another point that Mr. Rudlin mentioned, was that they consult, at least they consult and they involve people in those decisions. I'm not sure that the bottom-up approach, purely that will approach, but it has to be top-down and bottom-up towards coherent development policy. And
Professor Sunga, that's a very interesting to put forth there, trying to bring more people onto the table in order to find the best solutions. Thank you so much for joining us from Rome.